welcome to In Conservation, the podcast of the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. I'm Sophie Baker, editor of our members magazine Local Wildlife and host of the podcast. In today's episode, we're talking about our organic mowers, cows, sheep and even pigs, deployed in our reserves to help keep them in tip-top condition for a wide range of species. Farming and livestock management may not seem like the most glamorous or obvious part of our work as a conservation charity, but it's deeply embedded in our management plans and research projects for a huge variety of habitats. And the staff and volunteers that take care of these grass munchers have to be some of the most physically hard-working people across the Trust. From shearing to lambing to daily stock checks, their jobs keep them on duty at all hours and in all weathers. I spoke to Thomas, who gives us the lowdown on what they do at the Trust, and some insight into why it's so important, and why he loves it so much. What actually is conservation grazing? Because it's something that we rely on so much at the Trust, and we talk about it so much, don't we, in the work of the Trust and looking after nature reserves and things. But how would you define what that actually is?
I'm sure the standard definition would just be using animals to manage nature reserves. So, you're replacing manpower with animal power, which is fantastic because obviously a person costs money, or we can recruit some animals into that and get them to do it for free. But then there's also the cost of paying somebody like me to then look after the animals and coordinate it. But we can do more on a larger scale, essentially. So me can manage a lot of animals, whereas one reserves officer can only go so far with a lawnmower, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just a lawnmower. I mean, you'd imagine the amount of cutting you'd have to do on our reserves. Yeah. We have nearly 100 reserves across the three counties. It would just be...
Absolutely. And one of the biggest things, we get quite a lot of complaints when we're doing the stock checking. So there's some of the more public sites that you get a lot of people flock to do birding and photographing wildlife. And we do get a lot of complaints that people say, when we go out and check the animals, you've scared the birds away. Which, all right, yes, fine. We go out there for 10 minutes to go and check around the sheep, make sure everything's okay, check around the cows, make sure everything's okay. But if we didn't have the livestock, which the other wildlife is habituated to, you'd have to have somebody out there with strimmers every 3 weeks to keep on top of this vegetation. So it's actually, it's less disturbance to have the animals, I think.
Yeah.
And more natural, because there is no way we can recreate that natural grazing pattern by hand. If you went out there with a pair of scissors, you're not going to get that variation in sward length that you get that cattle naturally do when they graze. You're not going to get that browse line definition just right that where sheep will pick at the trees. It's, a much more natural way, and there's so many benefits and different things that actually come from the livestock that people don't really think about. Dung, these animals produce dung that goes onto the field, which then supports an entire level of invertebrates that without them would then disappear.
Absolutely. Going dung diving is an amazing thing. You see so many dung beetles in a dried cow pat.
I've never done it myself. Everyone always talks about dung diving. I mean, I've done some weird things in my time. I've never poked around in a cow pat with a stick. Not looking for dung beetles anyway, actually. Yeah.
I was going to say, surely.
At some point, absolutely.
Surely at some point your job has called upon you to do that.
Absolutely. Normally sticking it in a bag and taking it down to the vets. Get some strange looks walking down. That's either a very big dog or
so using cows and sheep, I mean, like you say, there's so many benefits, aren't there? Like they're churning up the ground as well. I mean, a strimmer's never going to do that, is it? In the same way as like the big feet of cattle.
Absolutely, you get so much out of one animal. I try to think of it in a comparison of like your lawnmower does one thing. It cuts grass to whatever level you want it to. Whereas your cow, like you say, you get different grazing lengths, you get browsing, you get marginal vegetation where they poach up a little bit on the outside of water, which creates little divots which have little pockets of water in, which then become a little micro-habitat. And this animal is doing this without even realising it. That's the thing. We haven't got to pay them a salary.
No.
As long as they've got somewhere warm and dry and got something to eat, they're quite happy to do it for free. I am Thomas Baker and I am the Northamptonshire's livestock manager.
And what does your job involve?
Oh God, where do you start? My job, essentially the basics of it is the Trust keep their own livestock, and I'm sort of responsible for the day-to-day welfare and tasks involving those. and planning out the grazing with those animals, so how we manage the nature reserves and where the animals need to be and when the animals need to be and how many they need to be. I wish it was as simple as just saying we put cows in a field and that's that. It's really not. And then the other thing we manage as well is because we've got such a vast amount of land and only so many of the trust's animals that, if we were to split them out, we wouldn't be having enough. We get external grazers in, so external farmers who are willing to work with us and put their animals on our land for us then sort of get that conservation aim by getting them to graze it. But then I'm responsible for managing what the farmers do, not day to day, but making sure they don't do daft things like putting too many on, putting a bull out where there's a public footpath or leaving machinery in the middle of the field or all sorts of crazy things. The right sort of animals, as daft as it sounds, we've had graziers chuck things out, alpacas out, so the licence sort of says, sheep and cattle, and you come down to an alpaca walking around the field, which,
wow.
You sort of think, why? I don't understand. Well, A, where have you got an alpaca from? And B, why have you put it in our field?
No,
it's strange.
Yeah, I bet. And some animals prefer to eat some things, don't they? So how do you manage it? Because, do the cows or the sheep go in and do they eat nettles? Do they eat, are there things they don't eat?
Yeah, there are things that they don't eat. I mean, water mint is a funny one. Slightly like summer leaves. Yeah, it's absolutely, you get areas where you get mats of water mint, which smells really quite nice, but must have an odd flavour because they just don't eat it. They'll choose to eat dying grass over water mint. I suppose, I don't know, I like the taste of mint, so whether or not cows and sheep don't like it, but that's one thing they seem to avoid. You get different things that they preference and different breeds. It's very complicated to sit here and sort of simplify it, but different breeds will preferentiate different things and different sort of grazing strategies. Between the cows and sheep, the sort of main difference is that sheep will nibble grass and plants really short, essentially, and have got quite a fine mouth, so they can pick little bits off. They can be quite selective about what they eat. Whereas cattle, obviously, their grazing strategies, rather than use their teeth to pick things, they use their tongue like an arm. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's really quite interesting.
But I've never considered that that's a difference.
Yeah, so they can't essentially selectively pick bits off, so they use their tongue and they wrap it round a sward of vegetation and rip it rather than bite it. Yeah. So they're not selective grazers, essentially. They eat what's in front of them. They can't pick bits out, which is great because if you want, if you've got a field full of wildflowers, then I've known sheep go along and eat the head of every single orchid in the bloody field, which is a nightmare. Yes. But then if you put cattle in, they'll selective. They can be a little bit selective in the fact that they want this green bit, but they can't then select individual plants out of a mouthful, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And you do get, individuals will have different preferences. We've got some sheep that are identical breed, but will quite happily go and eat the trees first, and then others will go and spend eating the grass first. And in the breed, they've got individual personalities.
Yeah, I bet they do.
Select.
And I bet because you're working with them so much and so closely, do you have favourites? You must have favourites. I know it's hard.
Yeah, well, no, it's not hard. I can promise you. My favourite species is going to be the cow. Sheep are people in the trust know how I feel about sheep. I won't say it on the podcast, but yeah, you know where this is going.
They're a necessary...
Yeah, necessary evil.
Evil.
That's the only thing I can think with sheep. They do... the problem with sheep is you've got a lot of them. So, whereas you might have 200 ewes in a field, you might only have 15 or 20 cows. So you get more of a sense of an individual with the cows because you can sort of see them in the group. And you can see the individuals rather with a sheep. You go, is that the same sheep? Because they all look very similar.
Yeah.
You get individuals with the sheep that are vastly different. So we've got one ewe that's got 3 horns, essentially. She looks a bit like a unicorn. She's got 2 sticking out the side and 1 directly sticking out the top. And we know her, so we can sort of say, oh, yeah, she's a bit of a favourite because we know who she is. But you don't notice too much of a difference in personality with the sheep, I don't think. You get little bits, but certainly with the cattle, because they're extremely matriarchal, their personalities are so different cow to cow. And you get some that are really mean, some that are really friendly. And it's a bit like watching EastEnders when you watch the cow. It's fantastic. You've got friendships, you've got dramas that go on. You got argumenting in the street. It's great entertainment. And most people think, when I'm explaining it to them, they must think I'm crazy. But when you actually get to know them and you sit down and watch them, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
There's a great book, I'm trying to think which, because it's Secret Life of Cows. if you ever get a chance to read that, that sort of makes me sound less crazy because there's somebody else saying the same things as me, that actually they've all got individual personalities, and obviously the matriarchal system, they all sit differently in those places, and it sort of shows their personalities off more, and they show it more than sheep do, I think.
Yeah.
But that might be that I spend less time looking at the sheep than I do the cows because I'm less interested in them. I'm sure somebody who's really interested in sheep might say the opposite.
Yeah, sure. And do you have favourite individual cows?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So my favourite cow, I mean, you're going to have to forgive the name here, is Crazy Eyes. The cows have all got horrendous names, and that is because me and my colleague named them, and we're not exactly very creative with the names. We've got Crazy Eyes, we've got Tubbs, we've got One Horn because she's got one horn, One Horn Sister because she's One Horn Sister. Yeah, the names aren't very creative, but it does let you sort of give an individual identity to the animal. Crazy Eyes is my favourite. She's the biggest cow we've got. She's an enormous cow, for a Highland cow anyway. She's dwarfs some of the others, but she's a bit of a paper tiger. She's up on the system of being in charge because she's big, not because she's argumentative. In reality, she's a bit of a coward, and if it ever comes to conflict, she's useless. She just runs away. But she stands there in the field and she'll give it the big I am, roaring and snorting and pawing the floor. But it's all a bit of a facade, essentially, because she doesn't do anything. Which, it's really quite amusing because we've got some littler cows who are obviously higher up the pecking order than her, and they'll just wave their head at her and she runs off. It's really quite interesting. And I mean, I suppose there's another favourite, which is Ruby, which is the first calf we've obviously had born at the trust.
Right, yeah, so that happened quite recently, didn't it? Yeah.
Well, you say recently, she'll be nearly 2 now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it seems to have disappeared, hasn't it?
Yeah. Still, though, it's surprisingly recent, I think, considering how long we've actually used cattle and, in conservation grazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the things when I started at the trust. We've got this group of Highland cows that were sort of ageing and getting quite past middle age, you should say, is probably the best way of putting it. And the trust were buying in cattle, and the price of cattle in the last sort of 4 or 5 years has gone through the roof. Whereas a Highland cow 5-6 years ago, you probably could have spent £400, £500 and got a nice Highland heifer. But now you're looking at £1,000, £1,200, and wow. It's just only on the up. And I'd sort of said, well, look, we've got a group of cows that are all a very similar age. There's going to come a point where we're going to need 10 cows all in one go. So rather than waiting to that point, why don't we think about breeding? And of course, it wasn't necessarily the breeding that was the problem. It was the thought of having a bull.
Yes.
You can imagine how that went down with everyone in the trust going, what do you mean we're going to have a bull on a nature reserve?
Yeah. No, it's very tricky. You have to manage access and, all of that
absolutely.
Stuff. Absolutely.
But it's worked out fantastically. The bull's really quiet. Majestic is his name. I didn't give him that. He came with that. He's as quiet as a mouse. He's obviously produced good calves for us. It's been very successful.
Yeah,
and the more we can do it, the better.
Yeah, and people love the Highlands. I mean, we know our visitors absolutely love looking at them and coming to visit them and knowing where they are on the reserves. But they do get moved around quite a lot, don't they?
A hell of a lot. They sort of spend 6 months, so to get more technical, there's things called a CPH, which is sort of a holding, which is like registered as a farm. So each area has to have a CPH, and we've sort of got, God almighty, 15 or 20 CPHs over the trust, sort of as a whole. Right. And every time you need to move animals move cattle between a CPH, they have to be TB tested, which is why when people say, well, you TB test these cows a lot, because we're constantly moving them. And by law, we're required to TB test them to move them between CPHs. But yeah, they sort of tend to spend, we have sort of, fortunately in Northampton, we've got it split out quite well, that it's almost divided in half. So they can spend 6 months on one in the winter where it's drier, and where it's wetter, in the summer when it's hopefully drier, they spend their 6 months there, and they sort of go through that continuous cycle. But within those CPHs, they're often moved sort of on a 3 weekly basis, because we're trying to recreate that natural movement of cattle. If you go back 1,000 years, 1,500 years, there would have been these large herds of mega herbivores that would have moved around the country, essentially. They would have hit an area really hard and grazed it down to the floor, and then they would have moved on, and that would then get a chance to regenerate. So we're trying to create a similar sort of thing with what we're doing.
Yeah.
But obviously, what would have usually moved the cattle on 1,000 years ago would have been predators. They'd have been to an area and then predators would have found them out, and then they would start to predate them, and then they go, well, this area is now unsafe and there's not much food, so they'd naturally move on.
Yeah.
So we're acting as the predator, I suppose, in quotation marks, and making these cattle move on. Which is for their benefit because they've always got something to eat, and for our benefit because we're getting what we want out of the habitat.
Yeah. And there's a lot of monitoring that goes on in those habitats, isn't it, to make sure that the grazing is working for what we want?
Yeah, absolutely. I spend it seems a lot of my time, walking around and keeping an eye on what the cattle do and what the sheep do, because it's a fine line between, well, this is perfect, and well, this is starting to get a bit damaging. Certainly on the wetlands, where you can have a deluge of rain and it can get wet overnight. They are big animals at the end of the day, and they can poach grassland up if they're grazing quite species-rich meadows. If we suddenly get a downpour of rain and it goes too soft and they start to poach up the meadow, they don't want to be doing that.
And what does poach up mean? That sounds like
poach up. Yeah, it's a bit of a technical term. It's making a mess essentially. So where I suppose, how do you put it? When you go down a footpath too much and it all of a sudden gets all muddy and horrible, that's poaching it up.
Right.
I don't know where the phrase comes from.
No,
I absolutely no idea. It's nothing to do with poaching an egg, is it?
No.
So,
or poaching animals.
No, yeah, very strange.
Yeah, very weird.
I don't know where that comes from.
No, but there are a lot of technical words like that in conservation, I find, or in sort of habitats. There's a lot of very technical language, which you sort of get used to as you work here. But poaching up isn't one I've come across before.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in farming as well. I mean, and it varies where you are in the country. They've sort of got their own colloquialisms for different things. And what is, so a shearling ewe and a gimmer and a hog are all the same thing, but just where you are in the country, that is what they call them.
Yeah.
And of course, you get used to one, and then someone will say something else. No idea what the hell that means. I don't want to seem like I've been farming for 10 years and I've still no idea what that means. Is that my phone? Ignore that then. Yeah, you just think, oh no.
Yeah, and that's the thing about your job, isn't it? I mean, I think it's quite apt in a way that your phone is interrupting you, is that you're always on call, aren't you?
Absolutely,
looking after livestock.
And like we were talking about, it was a recent thing. It would have been August time, where we'd moved the cows to Strawberry Hill. They got essentially, from our calculations, 3 weeks, 4 weeks until they were due to calve. Both my colleagues were away. One was in Corfu, one was on the Isle of Bute. And I was 4 hours away with my dad, about to start a clay shooting competition, just waiting for the whistle to start. And the phone went, and it was, I think, one of your cows is calving. I said, can't be one of our cows. Oh, it's a ginger one with horns. I think it sounds like one of our cows. And of course, it was on a footpath because we weren't expecting it to calve, or in a field with a footpath. And the one had calved on the footpath. Wow. So you sort of, I can't leave it because there's nothing really more dangerous on the farm or even on the trust than a freshly calved cow, because they've got they'll do everything in their power to protect their baby, and quite frankly, we're insignificant to them. They won't think twice, especially if you get some poor bugger walking down the footpath with a dog. Yeah. It could have been disastrous.
And that was at Strawberry Hill. So obviously that's one of our newest acquisitions. Very exciting. It is, and it's not quite open to the public in the sense that it's not really a nature reserve yet. We've only just taken ownership. I think as I speak, we're just about to literally take ownership of it.
It's this week, aren't we?
I think it is. But there are public footpaths. Yes. And there's public rights of way. So there's nothing. You can't shut those off.
No, absolutely. And I say we've got an area that the cows were due to go into calve where the public didn't have access, but because they calved early, and again, you can't control nature. No. When they're ready, they're ready. Yeah. I had to drive the 4.5 hours back and deal with that situation on my own, which isn't ideal as a start. But that's the sort of things that you can expect when you work with livestock.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to me, though, the difference. Like you say, you've been farming for 10 years or more. Yes. And do you feel like working for the trust is different to farming? How different does it feel?
It's different in some ways and then identical in others. There's less of a financial pressure working for the trust. When I was farming previously, it was, the animals were there to make money. And that was the idea, that you were keeping a business afloat with the animals. They were producing lambs, they were producing calves, to then be sold for that financial gain. Whereas you sort of swap it over to conservation and there's less of that financial pressure and we're more keeping the animals for the purpose of conservation grazing. It's very nice in the sense of when you have an animal you like, you don't have to get rid of it.
Yeah.
It's a lovely privilege to have, to be able to go, you know what, actually, I really like this animal. It's a nice individual. It can stay as part of the conservation grazing group.
Yeah, I'll give it a name.
Yeah, give it a name. And that's the deadliest thing. When you do start giving them names, you soon get attached. Soon get attached. But it's usually those ones that end up doing something stupid and dying. Yeah. And that is, I mean, farming, we were talking about Clarkson's farm, and he did show that quite well, that when you get attached to things, they usually do the dirty on you. And it is heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, because you work 7 days a week at times, usually 7 days a week, or certainly switched on 7 days a week, thinking about it. And then, some things are just out of your hands.
Oh, absolutely. At the end of the day, they are animals that are out, roaming in places, aren't they? And, there's only so much you can control. No,
we've got no control over what they do. You can put them in the safest field that you think is the safest field, and certainly sheep can find a way to do something stupid and kill themselves wherever you put them. Yeah.
No, I bet it is. It can be very hard. Very different to the desk job that I do. I mean, this is the thing about the trust. I think it is really fascinating that there's such a wide range of sort of jobs and roles that people do. And,
It's one of those things. I didn't know this job existed 10 years ago. I'd got absolutely no idea that there was a conservation grazing livestock manager. No idea. I mean, I'd gone to agricultural college to study to be a gamekeeper. I was doing countryside management. I got it in my head I was going to be a gamekeeper.
Yeah, wow.
And then while I was at college, I sort of fell in love with ecology. There was an ecology module as part of my course. And so I went, no, this is real. I always had an interest in wildlife, and which is why I wanted to work outside. And then sort of went, well, actually, I really like ecology. This is really cool. I want to do this as a job. And then went off to university to study ecology, but found ecology to be a bit too desky. You went out to do your survey, but then you also spent a hell of a lot of time inside doing paperwork and forms and
data. Lots of data.
And I thought, well, actually, you know what? I'm not going to like the amount of inside time that comes with this job. So I went back to farming, which was something that I'd sort of done on the side. I'd helped a friend out at home and got into farming and sort of accidentally fell into it almost as just to earn a bit of money, but obviously love working with the animals.
Yeah, so it's not your family.
Family. No, nothing to do with farming. My family, both of them work for FedEx.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, they're both outdoorsy people. My mum and dad. So we spent a lot of time outdoors, and they know the local farmers. So from a young age, I went around the animals. I got to sit on the tractors and stuff like that. But when I was looking for jobs, I was looking for a reserves officer's job. I think I'd sort of resigned myself saying, well, I'll just be I'm qualified, I can be a reserves officer. And there was a weekend livestock assistant job at Lilbourne. And I remember thinking, well, that sounds quite cool. Applied for the job, sort of spent, it was very quickly, within a couple of months of getting the job and being in the job, this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely, this is what I want to do.
Oh, that's amazing.
And then I've slowly worked my way from weekend assistant to manager, which is how have I ended up here? I'm still not sure. What were they thinking?
But I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, it does sound like an amazing job. And, obviously there's the side of it that sounds very romantic to somebody who's very desk-based, getting to stroll around the fields and watching the cow behaviour, the things that we've talked about. Yeah. But I know there is a very brutal aspect to it as well, isn't there? I mean, the weather doesn't wait for you. You have to be out in all weathers at all times, when they're breeding lambing season. I mean, I know you and your colleagues.
It is such a high and low, this job. You spend sort of 80% of the time on a real high and go, you know what, I absolutely love this. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And then there is that sort of 15%, 10% that you go, well, actually, this is heartbreaking. When you're lambing out in the middle of April, where you sort of think, well, the weather should be improving in April. And the last 2 years, it's been horrendous. We've had some of the wettest Aprils I can remember. It's cold, it's wet, you've got newborn lambs dying in front of you, and there is nothing you can do. There is nothing you can do. We haven't got the space to bring them inside. We keep these tough breeds of sheep so that they stand a better chance of surviving. But it is just... it's out of your control, and to an extent, you become hardened to it a little bit. But, lambing sort of goes on for 30 days. Come the end of the 30 days, I don't care how hard you are, it starts to wear on you.
Yeah,
and you take it home with you, and you sort of think, you start blaming yourself is the worst thing. And in reality, it's not yourself. And you've got very good colleagues around you that sort of say, well, look, you're doing a great job. But you just pop that in because you're responsible for looking after these animals. You do put that weight on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, climate change and the climate crisis and all the things that it's bringing with it, you know, more unpredictable seasons, much wetter weather, much colder weather in some instances, but much warmer in others. I mean, it does wreak havoc on processes, doesn't it?
It's making the job in places impossible. I mean, the wetter winters, the whole idea of our system we've got it set up is that the cows spend the drier months in the wet areas and then the wetter months in the dry areas. But the winter is becoming so wet that our drier areas are becoming too wet to graze in the winter, and we're doing damage to them. Yeah. And the animals are, you know, even the highlands, as tough as they are, they cannot stand if it's wet and cold for 80 days without a break. You know, they need to be able to get dry.
Absolutely. And their feet will just... Yeah, their feet start to rot. It is just such an uphill battle, the winters are. The weather is an absolute killer at times. An absolute killer. And the flooding, you know, we had... Was it 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago? We had that sudden deluge of rain, and we had the poor pigs at Summerlees. You know, we'd gone to look at them I'm sure it was the Sunday night. We'd looked at them and gone, well, it's a bit wet, but, you know, they'll be absolutely fine for the next 24 hours. Pigs
and then we
in
had...
mud.
It disappeared. Yeah. I don't know if you saw the photos on Facebook. The pig ark, the house they've got, you could just see the top of it. And in 24 hours, it'd come up 2 metres. Fortunately, pigs are very good swimmers. Yeah. And they managed to swim out and get somewhere safe.
Now, that is an unexpected fact. Pigs are very good swimmers.
Oh, pigs are phenomenal swimmers.
Are they?
Yeah, have you not seen the videos of like pigs in the Bahamas surfing? No. Oh, well, get on YouTube and watch that. There's pigs surfing in the Bahamas. It's phenomenal.
Wow.
Yeah, fantastic swimmers pigs are.
Yeah, well, that's lucky, isn't it? But I mean, you had a lot of rescuing to do. I mean, it wasn't just them, was it? There was so much flooding around.
Well, that was it. You know, we'd had sheep get stranded on islands. Obviously, where the water was shallow enough, they will sort of half wade through water. They're not particularly great fans of swimming sheep. But they will wade through water. But of course, this water had flooded up to the point where I couldn't stand in it, even in a big chest wade, as it was too deep. Yeah. And they were on a little island that wasn't big enough to sustain them, and the forecast was saying we were going to have more and more rain.
Yeah, it did go on, didn't it?
It was just ridiculous. And we ended up having to boat them off the islands and swim them off the islands.
I laugh because the image of it, I mean, there are some pictures which I will share on the podcast page if you want to find them. But yeah, I mean, it's just, what a job, eh?
There's never a boring day. There's never a boring day in farming, I can tell you that.
No. Here's a little aside, just for you. One reason our 3 counties are a special place for wildlife. BCN Beauties.
Hi, my name is Matt Johnson and I'm the Conservation Manager for the Wildlife Trust in Northants. Talking about the Upper Nen Gravel Pits Special Protection Area and Ramsar site. Quite a mouthful, but both are designations that indicate globally recognised importance for wildlife. The whole of that area, covering 1,358 hectares across North and West Northamptonshire's vital winter stopping off points for over 20,000 water birds each winter. That includes significant populations of golden plover, gadwall, shoveler and widgeon. And with plenty of muddy shorelines and grasslands surrounding water bodies, as well as key waterways, the Nen Valley provides a network of habitats ideal for visiting birds migrating from places like Iceland, Scandinavia and Russia. In our main nature reserves in the Nen Valley, Summerleys, Titchmarsh and the Nen Wetlands, where we are here today, we manage these areas to ensure they provide the best habitat for these birds, which need large, flat, wet areas enabled to feed in shallow water with a clear sightline from predators. A lot of the time this work can look really brutal, as we scrape back vegetation on lake shorelines and islands to create bare earth with big diggers and tractors, and create and maintain a network of shallow ditches, and we've even experimented with pigs in the recent years. This is all done with birds in mind, and each winter we're rewarded with the spectacle of thousands of wildfowl taking advantage of the areas. For example, last year, on just one day, we recorded 900 widgeon on Higham Lake at the Nen Wetlands. That's 3% of the entire UK population of this whistling, dabbling duck, feeding and sheltering on our nature reserve. And at Summerleys, we've seen golden plover return for the first time in a number of years.
we are very lucky at the Trust, and this comes up a lot in conversations with people across the Trust, is that the support of volunteers as well. So I know there are a lot of volunteer livestock checkers, aren't there?
Yes, we've got loads. So basically, essentially, most sites that we graze with Trust animals have stock checkers at least 4 or 5 days a week. We try to keep it that myself and my colleagues go on I've got it organised as a Monday and a Friday, so that ideally on the Friday we check them and go, right, there is absolutely nothing wrong. They should be okay over the weekend. And then on Monday we go, right, the weekend's been, let's just check everything, they'll be okay for the week, essentially.
Yeah.
That's how we sort of try and get it organised. But yeah, we would, without them, be buggered.
Yeah.
And we've got some volunteers that do 5 days a week, and it's not like half an hour here, half an hour. It's an hour and a half, 2 hours checking every day that they do, and they give up for us. And it's so appreciated, because we don't just deal with the livestock. We've got reserves to manage. We've got other bits and pieces to do. We're so sort of spread out and spread thin in some ways.
Yeah.
That if we had to do the checking, and I think several years ago, before the Trust really took on the idea of having a lot of volunteer checkers, members of staff were having to do it, and the amount of staff time that was spent on animal checking, because 2 hours a day can be looking for one sheep that's just decided it doesn't want to hang out with the group.
And we've got so many reserves that the travel between them as well. I mean, it'd take a whole day for one person to do lots of reserves.
It takes me pretty much a full day to do the round on a Friday and a Monday. You go around, there can be 5 or 6 sites that you have to drive around, each might be an hour between some sites, 30 minutes between another site. You can do 2 or 3 hours of driving in a day, as well as the walking around checking. But you soon lose a day checking animals quite happily, and that's if there's no problems. You get there and there's a problem to deal with. God.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's all sorts of problems that can crop up. I mean, they might escape, I suppose.
Escape, there's diseases, there's stuff like that. It sounds dog walkers, people taking their dogs for a walk. People in general just decided they're going to go and walk across a nature reserve because, we thought we'd go for a walk across this field.
Yeah, even though there's a fence.
Even though there's a fence there, and they've had to climb a barbed wire fence to get there. And go, we didn't know we could get, we weren't allowed in here, but if you've had to climb over a barbed wire fence, pretty good idea. You're not allowed in there.
Yeah.
There's 101 different things which can kill a sheep. There's loads of things to keep your eye out for. And it's part of it is a difficulty of using stock checkers, is that you can't expect them to be as medically trained as some of the professional livestock staff.
No.
And things do get missed, which then obviously we have to deal with, and that's where we have the fantastic people who ring up and say, there's a sheep that looks poorly. We've got a lot of signs around the reserve say, if you think you see a problem, call this number. And it's very useful, because a lot of stuff will get missed else. Because we're, that 10-minute window in 24 hours that we're going round them, a lot can happen between that 10 minutes and the next 10 minutes in 24 hours' time. We had a cow swallow a fishing hook this year.
Wow.
Obviously, it was at Summer Lees. And obviously someone had been illegally fishing there, because they're not allowed to go fishing at Summer Lees. I suspect they'd lost some tackle in the reeds, and of course the cattle were eating the reeds. And someone had taken a photo of her and sent it to us, and she got the piece of fishing line sticking out of her mouth. And she'd obviously got the fishing hook stuck in her mouth. Which, as you can imagine, is not the easiest thing to do dental care on a cow.
No.
They're not overly willing, and I don't particularly like the dentist, so I can't blame her.
But you got it out, presumably.
We did get it out, we did get it out. Fortunately, without a vet, we were beginning to think if she'd swallowed it. And that's one of those unlucky things, that if she had swallowed it, there's nothing we can do.
No.
We lost a cow, it must be a year and a half ago now. She's called Morag. And we suspect she'd either swallowed a fishing hook or got something stuck in her throat, because she had an abscess essentially come at the back of her throat.
Yeah.
And we kept treating her with antibiotics, and she got worse and worse regardless of the antibiotics. And in the end, the vet came out and gave us the dilemma of, she's not going to get better. She's going to have to go. And we had her put down, because she just, and the thing that he suspected, it was either a tumour that had developed at the back of her throat, or she'd swallowed a fishing hook. And we never did find out, because we didn't want to do the post-mortem on her.
No.
It's one of those things, you don't want to sit and watch an animal that you like
no
go through the post-mortem. So
No, but I mean, the fact that that's an issue, I mean, it just shows how important it is, isn't it, for people who are visiting reserves, to bear these things in mind. It's like dog walkers, your dog might be the most placid dog in the world to you, but if it's not on a lead, you can't predict how it's going to react.
You can't predict how it's going to act, and the people sort of anthropomorphise animals a lot more than they should, and the sheep can't tell the difference between your Jack Russell Terrier and a wolf. In their mind, it's a four-legged canid that's scary.
Which is why sheepdogs work.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why you can use sheepdogs, right? Yeah, because they react to them exactly the same even though those dogs are trained not to actually hurt them.
Absolutely. And people think, he's just playing, or even the presence of a dog with nervous sheep and cattle, that stress level can be quite detrimental. They can get a real spike in the stress hormones, and it can cause all sorts of problems. Abortion is a massive one in sheep. You might think, the dog's just had a quick run round them for 10 minutes or whatever, 5 minutes while you've walked through the field.
Didn't go
it's not biting. Didn't go anywhere near them. Just chased them off once or twice. But, I mean, you imagine a lion chasing you, your stress would go through the roof, wouldn't it? Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Wouldn't do you any good, would it? You'd take a few days to recover. And that's the same with sheep. It takes them a couple of days to recover from the stress.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and, like to acknowledge, most of the visitors with dogs, the vast majority, fantastic, and
absolutely.
really appreciate them. But it only takes one, doesn't it? That's the problem.
That's the real problem. It's the minority who ruin it for the majority, don't they?
Yeah,
And most people are brilliant. But you get some awkward people that, you say, can you please put your dog on a lead? And they'll tell you where to shove it. And, it's very difficult to deal with because there's not much power we've really got.
No.
But just for the sake of animal welfare, it's a 300-yard footpath through a field. Just pop your dog on a lead for 300 yards.
Yeah, and for the dog's welfare as well, and your own welfare, potentially.
If anything else, the sheepdog's welfare. Twice now, my dog has been working sheep and has been attacked by
really?
Somebody else's dog that's obviously come through the field and come bounding over. My dog's not overly friendly to start with, but, she's out there doing a job. And, ended up having a dog fight in the middle of a field.
Wow.
Because somebody's just had their dog off a lead walking through the field.
Yeah, that's not something you should be expected to deal with, really, is it?
Absolutely.
But it does reveal something which I think a lot of people won't know about the trust, which is that some of our staff members do actually have sheepdogs. I mean, I'm sure it's obvious to you. As a farmer who deals with sheep, you need to have a sheepdog. But there are actually quite a few dogs that do work for us, aren't there?
Yes, I think we've got four sheepdogs, I think, between the trust. I mean, I think they're all personally owned rather than trust owned, but they're on the payroll, which is fantastic, and it's awesome to be able to bring your dog to work. That's a very big privilege, and it is something that we couldn't do without. It's so hard to get across to you how much easier the job is with a dog.
Yeah.
And without them, several years I did do it when I was younger and fitter and I could run. Those days are long gone now. The dog does a lot of the work and the running and the leg work. And again, they're all individual characters. I mean, everyone who's got dogs at home will know.
Yes.
Your dogs are individual characters. You get some that are absolutely fixated on work, like my colleague's dog. She loves work. She's fixated on work. She lives to work. Whereas my dog is quite the opposite. She likes working, but you know what? If she's not in the mood, she'll sit in the truck. She'll pass this one out. Which could be very infuriating when you're halfway through a job and she suddenly decides, you know what? If you're shouting, I don't want any part of this. I'm going to go and get in the truck. If you're going to act like that. Yeah, she's a real character, my dog is Fliss.
She likes to keep you straight on the job.
Absolutely.
Here. Why are you shouting?
Absolutely. If I get, and the thing is, if I get irate at anything, she's quite a sensitive dog. If I have a shout at the sheep, she'll go, if you're going to be like that, I'm not being involved. She'll leave. No, it's not the time, dog. I need you now. I am sorry. They've got some great personalities. And great company, because you do spend a hell of a lot of time on your own as a sort of working with the livestock, because a lot of the jobs don't take two people, and you do spend long days checking livestock on your own or doing odd bits of work on your own just to have the company of something around, let alone, a friend from home who lives with you is fantastic.
I bet that is lovely. Even in the rain, the driving rain and the snow.
Yeah. I mean, I'll fully admit I'm a fair weather farmer. I hate the rain. And it's got worse as I've got older, a lot worse. So I used to 16, 17-year-old me would be out there in a T-shirt in a gale, knocking a post in, going, yeah, it's your own fault, it's the clothes, it's not the weather. And now if it's raining outside, you know what, this job can wait 10 minutes.
Yeah.
See if it blows over.
Yeah. But yeah, again, fencing though, that's another huge part of livestock, right? I mean, we do have some innovations, don't we? We've been working with a system called No Fence, is that right?
Yes,
where
that's
they
right.
wear collars.
A new virtual fencing for the cattle, which again is a blessing and a curse. It's fantastic in the sense of it gives you a sense of where the cattle are all the time. So if somebody rings up and says, "Oh, you've got cattle have escaped," you can check on your phone and go, "Well, actually, no, my cattle haven't escaped. They're somebody else's."
Yeah.
Which is a wonderful bit of security.
Yeah, because they wear these collars. They're GPS, aren't they?
Yeah, they're a GPS collar that goes around their neck. I mean, they weigh roughly a kilo sort of weight, but to a cow, that really isn't. I mean, it's the equivalent of us wearing a chain. They don't really know they're on. And then they constantly track the cow and constantly ping a report to your phone, so where the cow's location is. And then they have a map downloaded into them with a virtual line on that we can upload and download from our phones wherever we are in the world. So when I was sat in Tenerife, I was getting notifications to say that cows were being moved. It's fantastic technology. And essentially, as the cow approaches the virtual border, the collar will give them an audible warning. So they get this audible warning, so it will beat a certain tone to say that you're approaching a barrier. If they ignore that, they go, so the tone changes a little bit, gets a little bit higher, and then eventually on the third one, where it's a really high-pitch, obvious squeal, if it ignores it again, the cow will get a small electric shock, no different to it touching an electric fence.
Yeah.
And they essentially learn that this tone means, oh, I need to turn around, I can't go any further that way. Which is fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
It has the potential to make a huge difference on nature reserves, because being able to use livestock without fencing, I imagine the fencing is a huge hurdle to some spaces, right?
Huge hurdle and a huge cost, enormous cost to both put in and maintain.
Yeah.
Every year we have to do fencing checks, and some sites will have 100, 150 posts that need replacing every year.
Wow.
And it's sort of £6 or £7 a post, plus your labour to put them in, plus your time.
Yeah.
It's a massive undertaking to fence these places.
Anyone who's done any fencing of any kind knows that knocking in a fence post is no mean feat.
Absolutely. And there are some sites where knocking in a fence post is a dream. It's nice and wet, you can just push it in, and then you go up to some of the quarry sites where you think, well, actually, knocking in this fence post is going to take me 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And you're hitting brick after brick after brick, and that's what we've got volunteers for. That's it. I think it's the volunteer work tax, this one. Absolutely. But the collars themselves, they are obviously that blessing, because we can do this fencing, we can know where the cows are. They've also, this is what sort of started my interest in, it's going to sound really cow social lives, it's going to sound ever so weird, but you can see really who the cows hang out with. Because you can obviously, individual collars have got individual names on them. We can name them on the phone, so all their names are on their collars.
Yeah. And
you can see the relationships. So we've got the Loco sisters, who we bought them for summer lays. We called them the Loco sisters. They were Tilly, Tatiana, Tia, and Tallulah, were they? I think they were the 4 ones we bought for summer lays. And essentially, we called them the Loco sisters because they're absolutely mad, absolutely crazy. And we nicknamed them Mango, Coco. And I can't think of say Mango Loco, Coco Loco,
Right, yeah.
And they are absolutely crazy. But you can see them in the day, they disperse out and they're off grazing, doing their own things. They've got their own calves, they go and graze off with their own calf. But at night, every night, religiously, they come back together. And they sleep together as a group, all 4 of them.
Yeah.
And you sort of think, well, yeah, Christ, there really is. There's something to it, with a cow's social life. And you get individuals. So we've got 2 cows, Pixie and Dyson, who are essentially the trust matriarchs. They are, when all the cows come together, they're the top 2, Dyson being the matriarch and Pixie being her second in command.
Yeah.
They're always together. They sleep together every night religiously, and they've got this bond, and they do, as keeping all the other cows in check, they do it together.
Yeah.
And I say they've got a remarkable social life, remarkable.
Yeah, and they're definitely all characters, because I remember you telling me in the past about that, no fence is a fantastic thing, but there are some cows that will ignore it.
Yeah,
willfully.
we do. You do have some that ignore it, some that take longer to learn it. You've obviously got some that are obviously brighter than others. You get, much like people, you get some people that are very intelligent and some people that you are questionable. And yeah, some cows learn it straight away and they only ever get the one shock and go, well, yeah, right, that's it. And then we get other cows now. Poor little Ruby, whether or not the lights are on and nobody's home, she seems to get the most shocks. I just don't,
Yeah.
And she's got no particular reason for it. The only thing I could think is that she's been brought up with an offence, whereas all the other cows have had it on as adults,
Right?
And they're very mature and they've experienced life, and then they've suddenly got this thing and they've learnt it very quickly. Whether or not because she had it on from a young age, it's almost mundane to her. She just she doesn't know any different, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So a shock to her isn't so much of a shock, if that makes sense. Whereas the other cows who went 8 years before receiving an electric shock, it's something they really don't like.
Yeah, so they'll do everything they can to avoid it.
They do everything they can to avoid it, whereas obviously Ruby's had... there's a certain age, obviously, they can't have the collars on because they're not mentally developed enough to understand them. They have to be at a certain age to go, well, all right, understand the process.
And presumably when they're very little, they follow their mother.
Absolutely,
anyway,
they follow their mother. And the other thing is their mother follows them. So if you've got a cow that's suckling a calf, so we had this problem at Strawberry Hill, sort of the calf wanders out the zone because they don't have a collar on. The cow will follow, regardless of the fact if she's got a collar on or not. She will go with that calf because the motherly instinct overpowers the thought of an electric shock.
Yeah.
So they do, and that causes issues. At Strawberry Hill we had the problem of the fences weren't fantastic, and several times the calves would wander out and the cows would follow them. And of course we'd have to drive, it's an hour and a half to get to Strawberry Hill and you'd have to drive an hour and a half to go and get them back in. And of course the calves learnt they could do it, so they'd just do it. They could be quite mischievous. I'm sure they were doing it to spite us at some point. Because you go or you start going and they'd be out, and then by the time you get there they'd sort of wander back in as if to say, we know you've come to get us back in, so we did it for you.
Yeah, but we do take measures to we don't use no fence everywhere anyway, do we?
No, we don't use it everywhere. And I say it goes on the individuals it matters. So really, cows and calves, we don't use the no fence on to keep them in. We keep the no fence on them for tracking. That's fantastic, for the ability to be able to know where they are. So before, when we were doing stock checking, you'd have a 100-acre site and you go, where the hell are the cows? And you'd spend an hour and a half marching round to find the cows huddled in the corner that you'd initially walked past, but you'd just missed them.
Yeah.
Now I can look on my phone and know where they are. So I can get to site, look on my phone and go, well, the cows are here. I'll just walk to them. It's made an hour and a half stock checking into about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So a massive time saver. And same for the volunteers. There's a little QR code we can give them and they can scan the QR code on their smartphones and they can see where the cows are.
That's amazing, isn't it?
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But then, obviously, the downside is those things we've talked about and the fact that it's something else for us to maintain.
Yes.
So we're pretty busy as is. But the collars the batteries need changing. They sometimes malfunction. And it's not the easiest thing to get a cow to stand still to do it. We've got a few friendly individuals that will. And then animals like the Loco sisters who won't let you touch them with a barge pole have to be got into a pen and then into a crush and then change. It becomes sort of like a half a day just to change one collar.
Yeah.
And a lot of our kit is mobile, so they go on sites where there's no kit, so we have to bring kit to them to do it.
Yeah.
So it can eat into time, but I think in the overall scheme of things, it does save a massive amount of time.
Yeah. And the fact that it just means we can actually use grazing on sites that previously
Never
would
really
have
got
been
grazing. Yeah.
Not been able to do it, and it would have been completely man and woman power.
Yeah, absolutely.
Presumably.
Absolutely.
Is there a time you can think where having the cows on or having the sheep on has just suddenly made a really a noticeable difference to you?
It's a funny one. I mean, we started mob grazing Sulahay, so we took Sulahay into our own hands grazing wise. So we used to have Sulahay grazed in the winter by us, but we'd have a grazier come in through the summer to keep on top of things so that it wasn't ever too long or too much for us to get on top of ourselves in the winter.
Yeah.
And what we essentially did, we lost the grazier through the summer, and I sort of suggested, well, let's just winter graze this calcareous grassland site with all our animals, and we'll mob graze it, throw everything at it we can through the winter because it sits relatively dry, and they can spend their time up there, and let's just see how that does the site. And then certainly the first year after it was done, it was the most fantastic I've seen the site.
Yeah.
Because there was no we normally had to sacrifice a couple of fields every year that the grazier would graze, so they never got to flower. But either every other year or 1 in 3 years or something like that. Or never got to flower to their full potential.
Right.
And then, now we've sort of done that and say, right, there's no animals on the site from March till sort of now. It gets the full flowering season to itself. It's a fantastic site now. I love it.
Yeah.
And that's I think my biggest noticeable difference. We used the pigs at some of these this year.
I was going to ask you about the pigs, because that's a new thing for the Trust, isn't it? Having pigs on site. And they do something quite different, don't they? I imagine they do.
Yeah, that's fair. Again, the different breeds of pig do different things, as I found. That was a completely new one to me. So we sort of use 2 different breeds of pig. We use Oxford Sandy and Black at some of these, which seem to preferentiate grazing more than they did digging. They did dig, but they would almost graze everything off first and graze the tops off things off before they dig.
I don't think of pigs as grazers.
No, I was shocked because every time I've kept pigs, they just dig and dig.
Yeah.
But then we used my pigs from my own home on Lilbourne, which were Iron Age pigs, a wild boar crossed with a Tamworth.
Right.
And they just, all they do is dig. They're like earth movers. You don't need to buy an excavator when you've got those things. They just dig trench after trench. So that was really interesting. But that idea was that we sort of wanted the pigs on to control the stuff that the cattle and sheep wouldn't eat. So that marginal vegetation, the cows will eat it and the sheep will eat it, but they never really affect the root base of the plants. So every year it grows back and we've got the same problem. And the idea with the pigs was that they were going to come on and then they were going to eat the tops and then dig the actual bulbs up of the plants. The roots up, eat the roots and stop it coming back and sort of open up areas, controlled destruction basically.
Yes.
And it did work fantastically until we had a massive flood and they got flooded off site, which was an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, I bet.
But that's something really promising that, if we can utilise these things, because we're paying to have this vegetation flailed every year, if we can sort of use an animal alternative, which is more natural and cost less money.
Yeah, and create more diverse habitats in the same way that we were talking about earlier about the cows do. That sort of rootling around is a very natural thing that would have happened all along the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? How these plants evolved alongside animals that did that.
Absolutely. And all your wading, but it's obviously creating feeding habitat for your wading birds, rooted up soil that they can pick the grubs out of, and poached up again, to use that word, poached up areas, wet patches that they've dug over.
Yeah.
It could be really interesting. And there was no disasters. I think that was the main concern from the reserves officers, that obviously pigs can be quite damaging. It's certainly, as of all the livestock that anyone uses in conservation grazing, if pigs get into the wrong area, they can really do a lot of damage quite quickly. But they didn't get out, so we've proved that we can contain them. If we can use them as controlled destruction, that would be really quite cool.
Yeah, so that's quite a lot of innovation in your area, really, isn't it? Actually, the things are changing all the time. Obviously, your circumstances are changing because of climate change. It's kind of forcing rethinks on some things, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, this is the thing. The things are always changing. Like you've just said, the weather's constantly changing. The animals are constantly changing. Technology is constantly changing. The no-fence collars. There's never it doesn't get stale, livestock. No. They always do something new, and there's always something new to try. Yeah. We haven't spoken about the Mouflon. Do you know about the Mouflon?
Oh, yes. It's a breed of sheep, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've got these. They're believed to be related to the common ancestor of domestic sheep. Right. So I think the theory goes that people domesticated, is it the Asian Mouflon or something like that, as they sort of came across Europe, they got this ancient Mouflon, and they were domesticating them to be sheep, and a population of them escaped to the island of they either got onto Corsica or they were put on the island or whatever and then forgotten about.
Right.
And then the rest of the sheep were domesticated into the modern day different breeds of sheep. But this group of sheep that is related to our sheep but isn't related to the sort of domesticated sheep were obviously taken off the island for various reasons. Now they've colonised Europe. Known as the European Mouflon, and we've got a small population of those that we're trying to work with. They're a little bit wild because they are a wild animal, essentially.
Well, how does that make them different? What?
Remarkably intelligent compared to a sheep.
Yeah.
Remarkably. And they obviously, you can almost see that our domestic sheep, while they're aware of things, they've had almost the instinct of being predated out of them. So when somebody walks past the top of the field, they don't even lift their head from grazing. But the Mouflon are so aware of what's going on around them. Presumably, twitchy, you're right. Presumably because in the wild, they're predated on. There's wolves, there's lynx, things that actually eat them. So they've got that natural concern about life in general.
Yeah.
Like something's trying to eat me all the time.
Yeah.
It means they stick to cover more. They don't like coming out from cover. So we've got, large hedges that overhang. They spend a lot of their time, unless they're out feeding, they're under the hedges, keeping out of sight, out of mind. They're really quite cool. Really quite cool. A lot larger than a sheep. Not necessarily in weight, but taller.
So long legs.
Really long legs. They look deer-like. They really do. When they came, everyone thought I'd bought deer, and they took the mick out of me. And to be honest with you, I was getting to the point where I thought I'd bought deer.
Yeah.
Because they were getting longer and longer legs and starting looking more and more like deer. I thought, I've been had here. The bloke selling me these Mouflons just sold me a group of deer.
And what do they do differently that you want to try them?
We don't necessarily know at the moment. So a couple of people I've spoke to, so the chap who breeds them, obviously they're incredible browsers, so not really grazers, they prefer to browse. He seemed to think they bark strip, much like bison do. So that was the idea, that we were going to use them in areas of lots of scrub where there was lots of browsing. They can survive on just browsing, much like goats.
Yeah.
So sheep and cattle can't really survive on scrub alone.
Right. And just to be clear, browsing is kind of upwards, isn't it? So it's not grass. It's like
that's it. Browsing is more where they pick at things up. How do I describe this better? Grazing is just grass. Browsing is everything, including grass. They can browse on bits and pieces of a meadow. You can browse through a meadow, picking the herbs out in bits and pieces.
Right.
Browsing is more of a selective graze than actual grazing, which is nothing but just grass. Because they're really tall, they've got a really good high browse line. They stand on their hind legs like goats to get bits and pieces off the tops of trees. And I say if they do bark strip, that would be fantastic because we can use them in areas that we've got huge problems with encroaching scrub. So we've got an area called Stone Pit up at Sulahay, which is just nothing but encroaching silver birch. The cattle really don't eat it, the sheep don't eat it, and we spend a lot of time cutting it out every year, and it just regrows because the roots obviously then propagate and make new trees.
Yeah.
So what we're hoping is that it's a bit almost Corsica-like. It's a rocky area and our ex-quarry that's full of browsing vegetation rather than grazing. So we're sort of hoping these Mouflon will thrive there.
Right.
And we've got no-fence collars for them. So they do a sheep version of the no-fence collar that they are now trained to. So we have got them trained on the no-fence collars. The problem comes when we need to change the batteries with those because they're just so flighty. They're not an easy thing to catch to then change the batteries, or else we'd have probably already got them out there doing the job. We're still working on a sort of a reliable way to catch them.
I like that. There's a lot of pictures to my mind of all the ways you're trying to catch them.
Absolutely. You can imagine.
Because I bet they're quite nervous of things like fences, so they're not even going to be easy to herd into something in the same way.
They're very respectful of fences at the moment,
that's good.
which is fantastic because they're not. If they wanted to, they could just jump out like that.
Good,
Which I was more hoping that I'm not going to be the person that releases a wild population of Mouflon to the UK. Which I don't think. Just to confirm, there is no chance of to anybody. Anybody higher up in the Wildlife Trust listening. They will not escape, I promise. But it's more of a reliable way because we can get close to them. You can sort of get within 10 or 15 metres of them and they won't run away. But it's the actual catching them because they're almost too intelligent. They fall for it once, they don't fall for it a second time.
No.
Which is the problem. And they do respect a dog, but they run ridiculously fast.
Right.
And obviously in this area that is stone pit where we're going to put them, it's almost impossible for a dog to work. It's not a flat open field.
Right.
It's areas of big stone walls that the Mouflon are going to be able to run straight up and the poor dog's not going to be able to do it, and thick areas of scrub that, it's going to be a challenge. But we'll work something out.
Yeah.
I'll come up with something creative that everyone will just shake their head and put their head in their hands for. But it'll work. It usually does. Like most of my ideas.
Yeah, they sound fascinating, those guys, those Mouflon.
Yeah, cool looking. If you can get some pictures and put those up, they are.
Yeah, I will.
As primitive looking as, giant curled horns and big, like fluffy chests. So they really do look quite.
Do you have to shear them?
No, so they're self-shedding, which is another reason that I really like them, because, you haven't got to shear them, which shearing itself is a nightmare.
I was going to say that's a big part of your year, isn't it? Really, it is sort of looms.
Yeah, I've got a colleague that I'm sure if she's listening to this will be laughing at me because she quite enjoys shearing.
Right,
And this must be my least favourite job, shearing. It's hot, it's sweaty, you get kicked by sheep, you get plastered in sheep muck. I don't enjoy it. It's not a pleasant time for me. But when you've got 200, 250 years to get through, and from a welfare point of view, they need doing. Because if you don't do them, they get problems with fly strike. They get overheated. The summer's getting warmer at times. We had a 40-degree day, didn't we?
Yeah,
2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
You walk around in a wool coat on a 40-degree day. It's not comfortable for them at all. Shearing is, unfortunately, that's a necessary evil, much like the sheep.
Yeah.
But again, if we can get an animal that can do the job, they do breeds of sheep that self-shed.
Yes.
We've got Wiltshire Horns which self-shed, but they're not quite as tough as the native breeds, they're not other native breeds, so the other native breeds, so the Hebrideans and Manx we keep. They're a lot tougher but retain their fleece. The Wiltshire Horns are less tough but shed their fleece.
Right, yeah.
So there's benefits to them, but there's negatives to them as well. So ideally, you'd have something between the two. You'd have an animal that sheds its fleece that is quiet enough to catch, that is also really tough. It's the ideal super sheep. I can get on board with that animal.
But in the meantime, you have to balance between all of them and then try out these Mouflon. Who are just dying to outwit you by the sounds of it.
And it doesn't do much for the ego when you get outwitted by a sheep either. No. It really doesn't.
No,
don't mind it with a cow. There's something more forgivable when a cow outwits me. When a sheep outwits me, that's upsetting.
Yeah. What do you love most about your job at the Trust?
What do I love most about my job at the Trust? Probably everything. I mean, the cattle, working with the cattle is fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. And again, I didn't know this job existed in the first place. So I'm very, very lucky to have this position, and I'm aware that I'm very lucky. But to be able to work with livestock, which is a passion of mine, and nature, which is another passion, put the two of them together to make a job. It's a dream job, really.
Yeah.
And, you have bad days and things where you go, this is a bit of a nightmare or whatever, I'm not in the mood today. But on an overall 99%, I'm well aware I'm so lucky, and it's such a fantastic role and position to be in. And work with such fantastic people. We've got an awesome team at the moment in Northants. And there's the Trust in general. There is nobody... Nobody nasty, nobody bad, no nothing, is it? It's just friendly. It's a wonderful environment.
Yeah, it is.
I've worked in a few different places over the years. Certainly, agriculture, some little bit of time in retail, and there is no environment like this. Really, is there?
No.
I can't really describe it or explain it, but until you've been there and been in it, you go, well, actually, this is fantastic.
Yeah, it is. Well, yeah, and it's been brilliant to chat to you. So thank you so much for your time and for taking us through some of the challenges and the triumphs of conservation grazing.
My absolute pleasure. It's just a short window, so we'll get you out and do some cow work or something more exciting than sitting in an office. That'll be.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to it. Big thank you to Thomas for the chat, and to all the amazing volunteers and the cows, sheep, pigs and dogs that are helping us to do this important work. To find out more about conservation grazing, meet some of the volunteers and see some pictures of our beautiful lawnmowers, visit the website at wildlifebcn.org/podcast. Did you know that you can support our work looking after the wildlife and wild places of Beds, Cambs and Northants by adopting a Highland cow? You'll get a gift box full of Highland goodies, including a certificate and fact sheet about this amazing breed, and every penny goes towards the work of the Wildlife Trust BCN. Makes a great gift. Find out more at wildlifebcn.org/adopt-a-species. A huge thank you to James Williams and Jared Wentwick for the podcast music. And finally, do listen out for our next In Conservation podcast, and let us know what you think by getting in touch on social media at WildlifeBCN or dropping us a line from the website. Cheerio!